watch out. In wine, there's truth. You might let the secret of Sanford and Benedict slip out your mouth.
Okay, scoot in a little bit closer to Trey.
Let's see now. Yeah.
That looks good.
Do you see a through line from when the S&B Pinot Noirs were young to anything in this wine? Because it's fun to taste the old vines that you planted and taste some of the younger vine plantings that we use the same material with, and see there's a difference in terroir, but there's a through line between that selection.
Yeah, this wine's aroma very much speaks to me of home. This is the aroma. I mean, you've captured that very nicely. The structure of it is not. This is a bigger wine than the 75 or the 76. They were light and they were more delicate than this.
Which it's interesting because when you think of Santa Rita Hills Pinot Noir, the thought is they're very structural wines, and this block in particular is very velvety, very suave, and it's easily the most delicate in the cellar.
This velvet quality is really different. Really stands out, and I like it. I'm wondering, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now, if it might develop a little bit more. What do I want?
A little more broad shoulders, or
no, more crisper, more clearly delineated. The structure, parts of the structure are clear. It's very smooth now. You're talking about 1 year old.
1 year old.
Yeah, it's only been bottled for 3 months.
Yeah.
So and is that something that you found? Because you didn't know that this vineyard was going to produce age-worthy wines.
But first vintages were sold from brand new vines. They were 3 years old, 4 or 5 years old. The vines were babies, and they didn't have as many. They had all the parts, but the parts were in small portions, so they weren't robust. Eventually, they became more robust, and then it became like the 78s were just big, early wines that really need a lot of time to come around.
Yeah, we'll give people maybe 1 more minute to log on, and then we'll start. What do you attribute that to the 78 vintage? Because that was kind of a magical.
78 was very hot.
Yeah,
it was very hot vintage, and we also had a lot of second crop. So the first crop got very ripe, and the second crop still had all that nice acidity that second crops had. They put them all in the fermenter, and I think it balanced out very nicely.
Did the Rodriguez family pick the first and the second crop in 78?
Wow, that's a good question.
Probably.
Yeah. Well, I was not here, so I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Certainly, my dad would be involved
In the harvest, the
picking,
winemaking. Well, of course, right, and also winemaking and the crush.
Yeah,
the crush. I don't think he ever got involved in the old pump. He was. I didn't want him to mess up his gopher catching arm by
too valuable
training.
Yeah.
Say that for the young guys.
Anyone can operate a pump. Well, I think we've given folks about 4 minutes to log on. So so we should probably start and welcome everybody. My name is Trey Fletcher. I'm the winemaker here at Sanford, and my great pleasure to have a fun conversation talking about the beginnings of Sanford and Benedict with none other than Michael Benedict, original planter and really just visionary pioneer to come to the Santa Rita Hills and be a major driving force in the discovery and planting of the first vineyard. And
hello, everyone.
And Auggie Rodriguez, who still to this day is my right hand in the cellars here. but grew up on Sanford and Benedict Vineyards, and picked many a harvest in the early days, right alongside not just your brothers but also your father, who helped plant.
Who was my right hand back in those old days.
We got a lot of right hands in the room today.
Several generations of handedness.
But we thought it's so rare in the world to have, like we have here at Sanford and Benedict in the Santa Rita Hills. We have the first Pinot Noir winery, the first winery in the appellation, and the first wine grower, vigneron of the appellation, here with us, along with one of the earliest people in the wine industry. And I'm really excited to talk to both of you and get the real gossip and the real stories behind those early days at Sanford and Benedict.
Well, I want to honor Auggie by naming him the first vineyard brat in the Santa Rita Hills.
I get the title, okay?
Because he was a wonderful little kid in those days. But we all have to keep in mind that Santa Rita Hills AVA did not exist back in the beginning of Sanford Benedict. It didn't exist until what, 2003, 2004?
Well, we're actually going to be at the 20-year anniversary, so we're coming up on 20 years in Santa Rita Hills. So we've got 2001, and I think that really goes back to when you came here, and you had the famous thermometer hanging from your rear view mirror, right?
No, sticking out the wind, the little wind window in the front of my truck.
Right.
We used to have those windows. We used to have a window that would open up and stick this out, and close it down, and held it. I still have that thermometer.
You do?
I still have that truck. So
that's fantastic.
Still have Auggie.
Yeah.
Things don't change, and that's rather wonderful.
That's fantastic. And I think it's really interesting when you found this area that was cool, and that was really the primary driver. You spent a lot of time looking at the hundreds of years of historical temperature data in Burgundy and thinking about Pinot Noir that whole time, and finding this site, and happenstance being very lucky that it's coming up for sale, because the Santa Rita Hills were being threatened by a dam project to fill this area in with water.
That's correct.
And when you came here, was the goal right away Pinot Noir, or with you and Richard being college guys coming to stake your claim in the wine industry? You always knew Pinot Noir would be here, but what was the first thing that you planted?
We came here. The Pinot Noir thing was absolutely a goal then, but when we started our enterprise the previous year with our nursery, it was not Pinot Noir and it was not Burgundy. It was growing grapes that would produce well and sell well and be in demand in California. And this was in 1970 and 71. And those grapes back then were Cabernet Sauvignon and Riesling. So, and it was true. Chardonnay was not popular in 1970. Cabernet Sauvignon was in its real ascendancy in the Napa Valley. And the Christian brothers up in the Napa Valley were paying very good prices for Uriel Nielsen's Cabernet and Riesling up on Tepisque Mesa.
Yeah,
that was the original modern vineyard in Santa Barbara County. And what we did in that first year was copy what was successful already for them. And so we purchased cuttings of Riesling and Cabernet and planted them in in our nursery over in Santa Ynez. And it was during that year of 1970, winter 1970, early 71, that the bell went off about Pinot Noir. And that was kind of an academic interest of mine from previous, just wondering why Pinot Noir was a much maligned variety in California in 1970 and 71. The best growers were pulling out Pinot Noir vines and planting other things like Syrah and Grenache and Petit Durif.
And that was
Petit Syrah.
Petit Syrah, yeah. And was that because, principally those early Pinot Noir plantings in general were planted in too warm of a climate?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
It was it had not been successful in Napa Valley because the Napa Valley is a very warm place. And if you just compare the temperature of the Napa Valley, Yountville, Napa, St. Helena, Calistoga, that stretch with anywhere on the other side of the Atlantic, you can't find a stretch of temperatures like that without going to North Africa, to Algeria, and going away from the Mediterranean southward. You find that progression of very hot temperatures rather near the ocean. But Dijon, the heartland of Burgundy, was very much cooler, and I had studied those old climate records there. They had excellent climate records.
Absolutely.
So the only premeditation there was about coming to this place, about coming to this stretch of Santa Barbara County, had to do with climate. It had to do with temperature. It didn't have to do with rocks. It didn't have to do with anything other than finding a place for the average daytime temperature during the growing season. So
right.
From June, July, August, those are critical months. September, the average daily temperature didn't get above 78, 79, 80 degrees.
Doesn't bode well for Cabernet Sauvignon.
No.
Probably excellent for Riesling, but when how long were you wondering with the Pinot Noir that you planted if this was going to work out? I wasn't. Once I saw this relationship between the cool daytime temperatures of Burgundy and the cool daytime temperatures of our little stretch of Santa Rosa Road here, I was not really worried. I was quite confident. It was like months before I had an aha. This is why Pinot isn't very successful in Napa Valley, because it's just too damn hot. Yeah.
So our task was to find a place that was less hot and had a long growing season, so that we didn't have the threat of frost early in the season.
Right. And
that's what we have here.
Yeah, the fact that we're so close to the ocean, it's really temperate. It's frost is a worry because we have such a long season here, but our frost that we have here so far have not been, it's not something we count on every year. Luckily.
It's not been a problem.
Yeah.
And the Pinot Noir was still an idea when we planted our nursery. But Cabernet Sauvignon and Riesling were what we're going to go with, because we knew that those were the varieties that were in demand from.
Those were going to pay the bills initially.
That's right, and it was risk avoidance. So risk avoidance
is very important in farming.
That's right, and Uriel Nielsen and Bill DiMattei up at their vineyard in Tepiscay showed that. They had avoided lots of risk by planting those two varieties. So we just did what they were doing. There was nothing brilliant about it. That first year while our nursery was growing was when the Pinot Noir vision kind of showed up. And that was what really decided that to pull the trigger on this Santa Rosa Road, this area right here.
And did you plant Pinot Noir and Chardonnay at the same time, or did the Chardonnay come along a little later?
We planted them both at the same time. They came down.
Fantastic.
We purchased both of those varieties from Carl Wente who had just finished planting Wente family's Arroyo Seco vineyard in Monterey County, which they had planted with the intention of finding a much cooler place than Livermore. They were chasing the same grail that we were. They had completely planted their vineyard and had a nursery with about 12,000 Pinot Noir rootings and about 10,000 Chardonnay rootings. And so through an interesting process, I was able to make a deal with Wente, and we hauled the Chardonnay and the Pinot from Arroyo Seco, one truckload, put them in sand up in the barn, which was still a barn at that time.
You hadn't converted it to the winery, of course.
No,
Right.
no. And what it did was keep the rootings moist until planting season, the following springtime, the spring of 1973.
And when did you get your first Pinot Noir harvest? Was that 75?
75 out of 24 acres, 24 acres, 23 acres of Pinot. We got 2 barrels of wine, enough grapes to make 2 barrels of wine.
And this fascinates me because this is early winemaking. And did your family participate in that harvest of 74?
Probably my dad would have been the only one that would have participated as far as
But undoubtedly, I know Agustin, he would have been trailing around behind his dad at harvest time. This 75 harvest was very important because it was our first harvest. It was a big deal for all of us. None of us had harvested grapes before.
Oh, of course.
This is a new thing.
Right.
We've been working on this project for 5 years. We're in the 5th year, and now we're picking the grapes for the first time. It was a big deal.
Yeah, and for those at home, it's incredibly busy time, the harvest season, which usually kicks up in early September and can run through the month of October. And it's the constant challenge of following those grapes you've been growing all season long and picking them at the right time. And that's all easy to do and figure out, but getting the folks and the wherewithal and the logistics in there was no wine industry here.
There was no industry. There were no neighbors to call upon nearby.
The wine culture at that time was in California. There was no wine culture. And you picked by the bucket, and your family. You have a big family, Auggie. You guys, that's a lot of buckets.
I do. Actually, it wasn't until my first picking with my family when we came to the States, 1981. So I found it fun. I could relate to it because I had been in the vineyards, a good decade prior to that. So I found myself very attracted to what I was doing, and I was working with my siblings, my mom and dad, so I felt very comfortable. Trying to play a responsible role in the family. So it was fun. It was fun. I couldn't stand the bees, getting stung by the bees, but other than that, it was good.
No one likes bees.
One thing that I can say about Auggie and his family, I never one time ever heard them being yelled at. There were a lot of kids. There were a lot of Rodriguez kids running around. They were all orderly. They were all helpful. Never once did I hear Dono say, raise his voice, or Guadalupe. Doña Guadalupe raised her voice. You guys was a very soft-spoken.
We knew better.
But you clearly were guided, but you were not guided by any overt kind of control. That was very impressive.
And since we are talking about the beginnings and your family, being so instrumental in helping Michael and Richard in their vintage or vineyard vision in the early days. Let me just, I love this picture of you guys.
There it is.
Oh, wow.
There we go. 1 second. Let's see if I can share this picture. That's You can see that that's Auggie. And you described those are your Jimi Hendrix pants.
I call them
those
my
beautiful
Jimi Hendrix
striped
pants. Yes. God, so many memories come to mind. But I actually do remember exactly that day. Not as a whole day, but I do remember being there with my dad and my brother Ismael, Jose. My dad just being very the engineer of that retaining wall, which is still standing, still there, as many of other retaining walls that he got throughout the whole property. But I was happy there. I was happy.
Well, and those, I see something striking, Michael, and I don't see any drip irrigation. This was before drip irrigation.
Well, drip irrigation had been invented by that time, but we had no drip irrigation. The way we planted the entire vineyard, and these are, by the way, the vines right behind Don Jose and the boys, those are Merlot vines that we had planted the previous year. They, like all the other vines throughout the whole vineyard, were planted without any permanent irrigation. They were planted, each one in a basin. Each vine was given water by hand or by truck during its first growing season, and that was the only irrigation that they ever received.
That's incredible.
Up until, I don't know, 1995, 1996.
So, with the exception of the young vines, the dry farming was de rigueur until that time,
well,
in the mid-90s.
This way, grapevines have been planted and grown for over 1,000 years.
Right.
There's nothing high tech about this, and there's nothing uncertain about whether it works or not. The most important thing is that if you have a soil that's deep enough, that has water holding capacity, that will allow this approach of dry farming grapes. All grapes were dry farmed up until 1945 or post-war. That's when the irrigation started. The Israelis invented drip irrigation in the early 50s, and of course came here, took over rapidly, but we didn't irrigate our vines ever. And the vines never showed that they needed any supplemental irrigation because they were started so well. They were started very carefully to grow deep roots, and our soil allowed them to prosper without any surplus water.
And when you're going around and you're growing up on a vineyard, on Sanford and Benedict, and you lived on the vineyard and your family lived on the vineyard. You guys, you worked together and although the houses were not right next to each other, you were each other's nearest neighbors. Did you just kind of follow your dad around, or were you, going and, sneaking into Michael's house, or what did you get up to as a kid on a big vineyard?
Well, that was about the only thing that we knew we weren't allowed to do. You're not into Michael's house. But no,
that was not any imposition I made. That came from your parents, your mother. They were so very respectful. They were very respectful people, and I appreciated that. I thought sometimes it was too excessive. There were little kids would have been welcome at the time.
But
did you ever walk into the winery, the old S&B winery?
I did. That was many times. I guess my brother and I, our daily routine was we would follow our dad the first couple of hours until we got bored and okay, go back to your mom, and we went back to the house. And from the vineyards to the house, it took us a good couple of hours, which you could have walked it in 10 minutes. It just we would stop every 10 feet or so and did find something else to do. But yes, we certainly took adventures and explored throughout the whole vineyard, and so
it's a pretty beautiful place.
It's a beautiful place. I mean, we remember we would count the cars who would drive through Santa Rosa Road. Believe it or not, it would be a car that would drive either from Lompoc to Buellton, like every half hour, 45 minutes. It wasn't like now.
Yeah.
I mean, it was rare. We were like hey, another car, that's mine.
A car
So-
driving down the road was an event.
It was an event.
That's what you were
It's a
doing. You
noise.
turn around and get to see that car. Wow,
Mhm,
there's somebody driving down the road.
Sure.
And with being that separated from, what was the lack of wine culture at the time, and being so far on your own, how long into that first vintage with those two barrels that you had off the 75 vintage did you realize you had something special? Was it fermentation? Was it while it was aging? Did it take a while in bottle? Where did you get the glimpse?
You
were onto something.
I think at the time, at the moment when we pressed off the wine, I had 3 large plastic tanks, 55-gallon tanks, open top tanks that I fermented in and punched down in.
Oh, so you didn't have the big
No,
wooden
the
open
Wells
top.
press, that was later. That was a year later. But that first vintage 75, which was not commercial wine, we did not have a bond. We were not a legal winery.
Mhm.
So we were making house wine, homemade wine, which
Sure.
in those days, every American male head of household was entitled to make 200 gallons of wine every year. That was the law. That was what ATF enforced. Well, Richard and I thought that we could probably squeeze out 400 gallons because we were he had his household, I had mine. We could make 400 gallons. So that was
A good interpretation of the law.
Yeah, that was the ruse of the bureaucracy that we had to contend with. But the moment, getting back to your question, was when we pressed off that wine in a basket press. The piece of equipment that we bought to make wine, the first piece of equipment that we bought to make wine, was a basket press that had about a 55-gallon capacity. And it was when we were pressing off the must at the end of the fermentation, the 75 wines, that I thought, this really tastes far, far better than I expected. What do you think? Anybody else who tasted it, that's really good. That's really good. And so what it proved, there was a relief of the moment, well, we can probably make wine that will make people happy. And based on that wine, we eventually bottled it. And it didn't take long to go through almost all of it. I doubt it aged much more than a year and a half in the bottle. We were able, our financial partners, the 3 gentlemen who put up the dough for us to acquire S&B, they thought, based on that 75 wine, that this could be a good wine business. This is good wine. It was remarkably good wine. I still have a few bottles of it, and sometime we'll have to pop it. It's held its own very well.
Love to it.
The moment was when we pressed off and we had clear wine to put in the barrel to age a little bit, and it was just plain delicious. The same way the 76 was delicious. That was the first word that people would use. It's delicious. It was light. But it was complex. It was full, but there was nothing cloying about it, nothing overpowering about it. 76 harvest was our first commercial harvest.
Yeah.
We brought in a 4th financial partner with his contribution to the capital. We used his capital to build the interior, rebuild the vineyard or the winery, to buy the tanks, to put in the tanks, to buy the Wilms press, to really get us going in a commercial way. And that was far more nerve-wracking than the 75 harvest. The 76 harvest was serious business. We were in the wine business whether we liked it or not.
And why is that? Did you guys just have so much more yield that year, or?
Well, the grapes were a year older. The vines, the Pinot Noir vines, we planted in 73, and so in 76, this was their first really big harvest. The 75 harvest was tiny. 76 was, well, still a tiny harvest. It's probably 3/4 of a ton per acre. But then we had altogether probably 15, 18 tons of grapes.
Right.
And
That's real work.
That's right. And one of the most dramatic thing about the 76 harvest by far, aside from the fact that it was our first real harvest, our first formal harvest as a winery, is that one of the tanks of Pinot got very warm, and the fermentation stopped. We had a stuck fermentation or a stopped fermentation.
We've all been there.
Yes, and so but I was still reading how to make wine books at that time.
Mm-hmm. Which I should say, you are one of the few people that I've probably encountered in my life that can read a textbook from cover to cover and really absorb it.
Well, if it's something I'm interested in, yes, absolutely.
That's the trick with that.
And I had no choice but be interested in this. This was absolutely vital that everything go well. So a stuck fermentation was a real challenge, but the books wrote a lot about how do winemakers deal with stuck fermentations and how do Burgundians deal with stuck fermentations.
And this was a Winkler and then Revue de Vin.
Yeah, and Revue de Vin. And a funny little textbook called Viticulture Générale from France that was more about Rhone wines than about Burgundian wines. But anyway, I took the fermentation apart. I split it up into two. We drained off all the wine, put half the must in another tank, let the juice cool down a little bit by spraying it a little bit, and went back into two tanks. And with fingers crossed and toes crossed, the fermentation started again and then completed beautifully. And
it's funny because we would do a very similar thing to this day.
Well, I think we all could have read the same textbooks. They're available, and the urgency of getting it right, the anxiety that accompanied a stuck fermentation in my very first experience making wine was really it got my attention.
Oh yeah,
full attention.
Yeah. And winemaking at that stage, without having a winemaking culture or a winemaking community around, what were the decisions that you were making back then? Because I've had several of those wines from the 70s, and a lot of it is the vineyard. The vineyard makes a wine that ages very well, but let's not forget the part that human beings play in that. And were you doing a lot of whole cluster? Were you destemming? Were you?
We talked about the idea of whole cluster fermentations is a phrase that's become prominent in the 21st century. Even in the 1990s, people were starting to talk about whole cluster. Burgundians had been doing whole cluster fermentation for 200-300 years. Maybe forever. Maybe the original fermentations were whole cluster fermentations where they just cut the grapes and put them in the tank,
right,
and stomped around on them a little bit and let the fermentation go. And that makes wine. That's probably the original winemaking. And of course, that involved whole clusters. Mm-hmm. Having a machine present at harvest where you dump the fresh grapes in and the machine separates the stems from the skins and the juice. That's a very new idea.
And did you have a destemmer back in those early days, or how did you destem?
76,
oh, nice.
Had a destemmer. 75, no. 75, it was all just peeling the grapes off the stems.
Nice.
76, we bought a little Italian machine that is still around somewhere. I don't know where it is on the ranch.
I think we have it in the barn, at the Rinkenau barn.
Yeah, and we use that for all of our commercial, all the vintages up through 1987 or so. And it worked very well. It was noisy.
They all are.
And it required a lot of labor because it required a sharp guy to be able to pull the bucket out from underneath the spout and move an empty bucket in at the same time. And then we had a chain gang taking the buckets into the winery and dump over the top. That way, the wines got very well, or the juice, the must got very well aerated. It was a very constructive process, having the juice drain into a bucket, tossing the bucket, pouring it in. That seemed to never have made bad wine from that process.
And once you did that and the fermentation's finished and you were pressing, where did you get those early barrels? Was it clear that French oak was the way to go, or?
From Tonellerie Serug.
Ah, yeah, very
and
famous.
At some point,
in France.
You know that one pretty well. One of the Serugs came through. I think they probably came down to visit Firestone. You remember Firestone started their winery in 73. So our Cabernet and Riesling from our very first harvest in 73 went to Firestone. And they were a much larger winery and had a much higher profile. And I believe that the Serug gentleman came through because of the possibility of sales to them. And Brooks Firestone told him about, you got to go out and see these guys on Santa Rosa Road. And he came out and he took pictures, introduced himself. It was easy because we knew we had not thought that far ahead about where we were going to buy barrels.
Right.
But Monsieur Serug drove up our driveway saying, I have barrels, good French barrels to sell. And so it was very easy to place that order. And then I think his rep was Barrel Builders up in St. Helena. So the Serug sent our barrels to St. Helena where they were assembled, made into real barrels. And
so they sent them over as staves. That's amazing.
They sent the staves for 3 barrels inside of one barrel.
Yeah, and now, I mean,
and so a barrel full of staves is about as heavy as a barrel full of wine. I mean, it's full, and very precisely packed, very, very precisely packed. And the curvature of the staves met the curvature of the barrel in which they were riding.
That's a tight pack.
Tight pack.
You know, and to this day, I complain. You know, when the truck arrives to deliver at our front door, all the barrels that we ordered for Francie's vintage, they are fully assembled, and all we have to do now is take the plastic off of them. We have it so easy now.
Very easy.
Back in those days, there was no one within 300 miles of here who knew how to put a barrel together.
Right.
But barrel builders, they had the expertise. So the barrels came from them as fully assembled barrels. And they were beautiful. Serug barrels, well, they still are one of my favorite. A couple of vintages later, we got some puncheons, some Serug puncheons that were outstanding for fermenting Chardonnay.
Yeah. Chardonnay just seems to love a bigger barrel. You know, you get the heat, and the contact with the lees is a very different interaction. It seems like they play well together. Harder to unload off of that truck, though. That punches a big barrel.
That's a big challenge. Yeah.
Well, those original days making wine at S&B were very different from what you do now. And every time I see Auggie with a forklift lifting a bin up there 25 or 30 feet in the air to dump it in the top of this giant press, it makes my heart kind of quiver a little bit because it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
We did everything on the ground. Everyone had their feet on the ground, and we did everything by buckets.
By necessity. I mean, you know, when did you guys get electricity at that winery? Did you have a generator right away, or?
No, I think let's see, probably 76 was the first year we used the Wilms press. And we got electricity for one reason only, and that was to create pressure for the Wines press.
Right.
That requires, a fair amount. Required 240 three-phase electricity to spin it, and so we got a three-phase diesel, a little John Deere diesel generator that would put as far away from the winery as we get out across the yard.
Still there.
It's still there.
Far East.
Yeah.
And so with having a press, with having the stemmer, how did your winemaking philosophy change over the years? From going from building your own barrels, how did you adjust to what you learned on the ground, and how did your thought process change?
In the beginning, 75, 76, there was not a winemaking philosophy that was driving decision making, other than read the books.
Right.
What do the good guys do? The guys that are making really good wine, what do they do?
And it was all Burgundy.
That's
there
right.
was no one in America at that time that you
The
thought
closest, well, the Martin Ray phenomenon up in Saratoga
Mhm.
was still around. His wines were around. He was not, I believe, but his processes were well known, and he learned from Paul Masson, the man.
Right.
And it was all small tanks, tanks that are about 600, 700, 800 gallon capacity were the ideal tank size, and that's because of the thermodynamics, the heat exchange, and everything else pretty rudimentary. The fact that you put the grapes in the tank, you crush the grapes. I always added yeast, so there was a philosophical idea, because the thought was that we were so isolated. We were not in a wine growing area, that we were so isolated that we would not have a viable population of good wine yeast, Saccharomyces.
Right. Right.
And
That's a real concern. It's not like there's a lot of fruit trees around. It's not like there were vines here for hundreds and thousands of years.
So one of the first things that I did, even in 1975, was purchased from, Scott Labs, I believe, yeast, Saccharomyces yeast, called Montrachet.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Montrachet is very famous, and it had a classy name. It's got a V something name to it now. So I used wine yeast, made a culture, and that was the only kind of philosophical, kind of technological thing. Otherwise, just have the right size tank, crush the grapes, add some yeast, and stand back. Punch it down. Probably those early years, I suspect that several of the vintages we punched down too much. We didn't need to extract as much, because they came out, the wines ended up being very full of extract, which is a very good thing.
Yeah, especially Santa Rita Hills Pinot Noir, it will give you plenty. It doesn't require too much contact.
Well, these were non-irrigated vines. They were small vines, so they have plenty of extract on their own. And I think maybe the 79 vintage, I overdid the punch downs a little bit. Maybe did a little bit too much.
It's, I find it so funny. We all have those vintages that we carry with us where, you think back, God, that was the one vintage where I might have, pushed it a little too far. And you hold that for a long time.
We remember the tough vintages, the bad ones, not the good. The good ones, they come and go, but the bad ones really get our attention and don't go away. You remember the anxiety that you felt because things were going on. The fermentation stopped, or we punched down too much. Now the wine, I can taste too much extract in the wine, even before it's pressed. The anxiety has a longer presence than how wonderful the wines were.
It's the pressure of farming.
Yeah, it's just farming. So anyway, Auggie was witness to all of this, and in various ways, he was always of the brothers. he was the one who was present. I think you were fascinated with your dad. You paid attention to your dad. Your dad was always active around the winery, and you were always watching him. My first recollection of Auggie in the winery was when Don Jose was laying the floor, when he was putting the floor in.
For the Sanford Benedict Winery.
S&B winery. And Auggie was up there watching him do that. And all the flags had been assorted out in front. So it was possible he could really help his dad, because picking up flags out of a pile of flags does not require the same assessment of, is this the right rock, the right shape, the right size, and all the right thickness.
We still pick up flags down routinely.
Oh, yeah. There's still quite a bit on the property. But it was interesting how he could tell, as Michael explaining, the way they shape, the thickness, whether it's too thin, and it was remarkable seeing how everything started to come alive. And the floor is still there, still exists.
Yeah, the floor is one of our best floors on the property.
Well, certainly the prettiest floor on the property. It's got some low spots to it. It could be repaired easily.
Could be repaired, Auggie.
No,
I mean, not right now, but when we can get around to it.
Sure. That's something I would love to do.
I'll hold the flashlight.
We can't get past this little meeting today without, I have to comment on one of the funniest things, and the loudest I ever heard Auggie's voice is when he was inside the newly built, what I call my lab, or the tasting room. It was that corner of the winery that was.
Do you know where the story's going?
Yes, I do.
And the doors were swung outward. The lowest window swung outward. That was my idea, that in the way we cooled the building, but it was by opening the big doors at night and letting the cold air pass through. And the whole thing about, and then closing the door in the daytime. And so the whole thing about.
So passive refrigeration.
It was passive refrigeration. You could let the air out, but you couldn't let the air in. The air that wanted to come in during the daytime was much warmer than we wanted. So everything was arranged for the air to leave. And so these little swinging windows were opening outward, and Auggie was inside, and he decided he was going to crawl out through one of those swinging windows.
How old were you?
I found the door to be way too far.
Yeah.
So
that was probably 76, I would guess. So you were
just about. I was turning five and a half.
So he got his head out and his shoulders out, and it was a lot farther down to the ground on the outside than he thought it was from the inside, because the floor, he was up here going, and then he looked out, it was too far down, and he got cold feet or something, and he didn't want to go farther, and he tried to back out, and the swinging window caught, I guess, in your belt or something, and he couldn't get in.
You got stuck in the window?
I got stuck in the window.
And what he did, he started screaming.
Wow.
I mean, loudly.
Yeah.
And it was the only time I ever heard Auggie make any sound like that. But it was so damn funny. His little kid he was not in any danger, but he was absolutely not in control. And it was like a dragon had come down and grabbed him.
Yeah.
And he was screaming for help.
I can almost remember. I couldn't go backwards. I couldn't go forward. So I was panicking. I panicked, and then. But I knew at the time. I knew if I'm going to scream, I'm going to get it. So
how'd you get out of there?
I had a choice until Michael came, and he looked at okay, all right, what can we do? He started thinking about what can we do. How did you and my dad get me out?
You were not really stuck. What it required was to pick you up by your legs. You were a little guy then, and push you. I mean, you were trying to get out, and the window had you stuck like this. You're trying to get back this way, and you couldn't. And so the trick was to pick you up by your legs and hold the window out, push you so the window would go out, and then hold it out and pull you back in this way.
You've come a long way. I mean, I pretty much spend all my days now asking for asking Auggie to help me, and I can't imagine you being helpless in a winery. You run the show here, and you're so knowledgeable and intuitive. I mean, it shows. You've been getting out of jams in the winery since '76. That's so good.
Yes.
Well, if Auggie if we had to retrieve Auggie from the same situation today, it would not be anywhere near as easy as it was then.
Might be just as funny though.
Well, I'm smarter now, so I'm thinking I wouldn't do it.
Yeah. What and then just with that, at what point did you see this idea of Pinot Noir in this area catching on? Besides what you and Richard were doing in those early days, when did you see that starting to take hold?
Well, the press got a hold of it. It was probably 1978 when the press started talking about our 76 wines. We got very good publicity. I think mostly because we were all by ourselves, we were unique, and we were making a wine from Pinot Noir, and what others said was exceptional for Pinot Noir in those days. And I never tasted another Pinot Noir like our early ones. And it was just when the press started happening. Robert Balzer wrote a big thing. There are lots of people wrote well about us, and other local people. Pierre Lafon was one of the very first, because he was close by, and he'd been to the winery a bunch of times. He bought property over across the river on Mail Road. Brian Babcock's father, not Brian. Brian was a little kid younger than Auggie, I think. But his father was interested in buying a property to plant grapes. They bought their ranch up on Highway 246, and it just went on and on. Pierre planted more and more vines. He was producing wine under Sanford Santa Barbara Winery label.
Yep.
He already had a winery. Had been in the wine business for about 10 years prior to that. And his winemaker was Scott Labs. He would send the samples up to Scott Labs, and they would tell him what to do next. And he was modest about it. He was not the least bit pretentious or defensive. That's the way he made wine. He sent them samples, and they told him what to do. And eventually, Lafon Santa Barbara Winery wines became really quite good. But between ourselves here, Sanford Benedict, and Lafon came in across the river, his first vineyard, in Babcock. And then others started coming in, buying around those properties. The subdivision across the river from us here was called Lakeview Estates. A lot of 40-acre parcels. There are 38 40-acre parcels over there. So they were small parcels, and people started buying them without realizing that they had a terrible problem with access. They didn't have access, and they didn't have water. And
those are two big problems.
Two very big problems, and very few persisted. Richard came here, I believe, in 93 or 94, bought the old Rennie Ranch for an next door neighbor here.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Coopers, the Bears, planted vines over in Utah. I think most people just want to go where somebody else is already doing it. We had the same intellectual relationship with Timotei and Nielsen. They were doing it. We didn't want to do it over there. I knew that Tepiscay Mesa wasn't the place, but they were already in the business, so we did many things that they did as far as viticulture's concerned. But you get somebody in who's having success, pretty soon there's an accrual of neighbors who just come in because somebody else has been there before and doing it right, and it's a fun thing to do.
Wow. I think, I'm, really grateful and thankful for not just our relationship, but all the work that that your families and you put into the Sanford and Benedict Vineyard, and having the guts to come out and follow that intuition and that thought and that dedication. And we all really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Cheers.
Cool.
We'll do it again.
What a pleasure. Do it.
Cheers, everyone. Signing off. Have a great evening, and thank you for joining all of us.
Cheers.